Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football, ranking the position groups for this Florida Gators program heading into 2024. Dill, at least in my mind, one of the more fascinating programs as we head into the fall, where there's so much potential on this roster. A lot of young talent that could play some very good football in the 2024 year. And there's just a part of me that hopes Florida puts it together in the 2024 year. Billy Napier can keep his job, because I look at this roster and what it could be in 2025 and in 2026 and say, this is a program that can compete at the highest end of the SEC. If they can keep this young talent together and kind of keep building in the right direction. Really excited to get into this one. And Dill, you look at these rankings, it's a lot of projection. It's a lot of, hey, where's the young talent going to really step up heading into 2024? Fired up to get into it. Before we do, and as always, one massive shout out to you guys. It's been a blast taking looks at all of these programs from a ton of different angles during the offseason. The Florida Gator fans specifically always show a ton of support. Can't thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, would love to hear some of your feedback on some position rankings, though. I know I have some hot takes. I know we don't necessarily agree on some of our rankings. And without further ado, let's get into my number one position rank for this Florida Gators program. That's the quarterback spot, right? And you're going to have to apologize when it's your chance to talk about Dalton Graham Mertz heading into 2023. Dill, he emerged as one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC. You take a look at what he did in the SEC in 2023 behind an offensive line that might have been the worst unit in the SEC in the 2023 year. You look at Graham Mertz heading into 2024, what we think is going to be a better offensive line, an upgrade at the pass catchers in the room. I look at Graham Mertz and say, how many quarterbacks are we taking over him in the SEC heading into the 2024 year?
I think by the end of the year, he was playing with making plays. And that was kind of the thing I think I questioned it. And obviously he very much proved me wrong once he got out of that Wisconsin straitjacket, if you will, of recruiting. He was able to kind of develop some of that, like making plays, throwing the ball on the run, escaping sacks, those type of things that I just didn't think he had. He started to prove it. And you always knew, I mean, he had that accuracy. He was just very consistent. He put together a heck of a year, and I obviously doubted. I didn't think he had that in him. I didn't even think he had top-end SEC talent in his game, and he certainly proved me wrong.
I think he proved a lot of people wrong. And I'll say I wasn't necessarily like the biggest supporter of Graham Mertz. I wasn't nearly as down on him as what seemed the national media is. But you look at 2024 and say, I don't know how many quarterbacks I'm taking over Graham Mertz in this 2024 season in the SEC. Then you combine that with DJ Lagway as your quarterback too. I mean, if you're Florida, you look at this quarterback room and say, we think we have quarterbacks that we can win a lot of football games with heading into the 2024 season. Going into my number two position for this Florida program, a little bit of projection that is going on here. It's the defensive line. And what stands out to me about Florida on the defensive line, particularly in this year, it's finally deep. You look at the last couple of seasons with Florida, they might have had some high upside guys, right? Princely Ewer, Gavon Dexter. The depth on this Florida defensive line has been a disaster. And Billy Napier knew that. And what does he do on the high school recruiting trail? What has he done in the transfer portal? He's gone in and filled this Florida defensive front with really capable bodies. Now, you have some high upside guys. Joey Slackman fascinates me coming from Penn. Cam Jackson, Caleb Banks played some really solid football, but then you look at the young talent, Kelby Collins, potentially LJ McCray as a true freshman. You're deep on the defensive line with, I think, some high upside talent. This is a unit that I think can surprise a lot of people in the 2024 season.
So I had D-line at 4. I'm so a little surprised you don't have wide receiver at 2. That's where I had him. Before I dive too deep into the wideouts, my issue with the defensive line, I think fundamentally, is a lot of these guys were here last year, and it just was not a well-playing unit. And I think, again, the talent in that room is far better than what they were putting out on the field. That group, I think, does need to – again, you can be all talented as you want. I think Florida's probably dealt with this for a long time where they've had talent and they're not playing to it. They need to put that on the field. That's why I have them at 4. I thought the wide receiver room started to do that. I thought they were playing really good ball. They have some upside. I think this defensive line, you said it. I mean, that crop of true sophomores is really exciting. I think TJ Searcy's got the talent to be really good. Cameron James, Kelby Collins, they all have the traits. They had flashes of really good football last year, but I think as a group, that just collectively they weren't good enough. And before I put them over some really good units like what I think the wide receiver and secondary rooms are, I think I need to see more.
Outside of Chris McClellan, who do you think underperformed that much? I thought you had some guys that
They're
potentially
giving up a lot of yards in the run. I know that.
the unit as a whole, but I think that had a lot more to do with just getting grinded down. Like, I just don't think they had the amount of bodies you need in the SEC to play on the defensive line. They were relying on a lot of guys that were young. I mean, you had a lot of true freshmen and young cats playing a lot of football in the SEC, which is not necessarily ideal. You look at what they have coming back. I mean, redshirt juniors, redshirt seniors. You're bringing Joey Slackman as a graduate. I think the depth is a lot better. And I think in turn, you see this defensive line play a little bit better. Side note, Coach Chapman coming in. He is.
I was going to say, I think the coaching change at linebacker and defensive line was
huge.
I think both needed to have a change. Both needed, obviously, a different voice because both units are very talented and did not play great football last year.
All right, number 3, I have the pass catchers as well. And what you obviously know, Eugene Wilson is a guy, one of the better just dynamic playmakers we see not only in the SEC but in the country. What I love what they did is they saw, hey, we are young but talented in the wide receiver room. Let's go out and get some guys that have played a lot of football at a high level to balance out some of that youth. Shamir Dike, I think, is a really sneaky addition. I mean, we were looking for a guy that could work vertically down the field within this Florida offense, something that they just didn't really have that much of last year. I mean, you look at Eugene Wilson, a guy that kind of works in that short intermediate route tree. Ricky Pierce saw much more of an intermediate wide receiver as well. We were banging the table for Florida to push the ball down the field a little bit more with Graham Mertz. I think Billy Napier would argue, say, hey, our offensive line couldn't pass protect. That makes it hard to get some of those longer route developing concepts down the field. They also didn't really have a wide receiver that excelled work in the deeper third. Shamir Dike is that guy. Then you bring in Elijah Badger, who is a dog after the catch along with Eugene Wilson. Look at that starting 3 wide receiver and say, I feel pretty good about that. Then you sprinkle in Aiden Mizell going into year 2, Andy Jean going into year 2, and then Arlis Bordenham at the tight end position. I look at Florida and say, I can kind of get with what this pass catcher unit is going to look like in the 2024 year a little bit.
Yes, I'm having no debates about that. I had him at 2, and I think the big thing is I thought they played good last year. Eugene Wilson, I thought, played really, really good. I think Khalil Jackson's a guy who's solid, dependable guy you can believe in. And then I think you go add the 2 transfers, along with the fact that you have that young talent coming up through the pipeline. I do think this is a really nicely constructed unit for the Florida Gators.
I'll say one other thing. Tank Hawkins, just watch out for him. He's going to be a true freshman. He's a small guy. Speed plays, man. Like, we see kids from the high school ranks who are just the fastest player on the football field have success immediately. I don't think he'll be a starter. I don't even think he'll be that involved in the rotation, but he's a guy that if you can get him a few touches per game, maybe let him work vertically down the field a few times, he's got game-breaking ability in the speed department. Number 4, the linebacker room, a fascinating position group. The Florida Gator fans who've been rocking with the fellas for a while know that I am extremely fired up about what the potential is for these linebackers, right? It starts with Shamar James, a guy that we've seen play extremely good football. Pup Howard, a guy that we haven't seen play great football yet, but know has the physical traits to play really good football. You have an experienced kid in Derek Wingo, and then you sprinkle in Miles Graham and Aiden Childs with Ben Roberts taking over this linebacker room. I look at it and say, you got one of the most talented linebacker rooms in the conference, although they haven't necessarily played great football yet. And then you combine that with what I think is an elite player developer at the linebacker position with Coach Roberts. The sky's the limit for this unit. There's a reality where we're talking about this linebacker position being the best unit on this football team in the 2024 year.
All right, now I have to dive in. The fact that you have the secondary so low in this ranking, I think, is preposterous. I think what you saw from Castell and Bryce Thornton, I think that's exactly what you want to see from young safeties, both really good. I think they're physical. They can tackle. They can cover. I mean, Jordan Castell, I think, will be one of the better safeties in the conference by the time he hits that junior, senior year. And then I think you added a handful of guys in the portal who just raise the floor a little bit. I think good, dependable guys. I think, frankly, you're going to see mostly Castell and Thornton still. I think those are the two most talented players. And then at the other spots, I mean, again, you have good young guys coming up through the pipeline. Jakeem Jackson, if Jason Marshall slips a little bit or doesn't play a little bit better, frankly, you have guys who I think can push him and be on his heels and keep that room competitive and play good ball. And then Sharif Denson's a guy I think has all the makings of being a really, really good nickelback. I think this is a really good unit for Florida in 2020.
Very similar conversation to the linebacker spot. All the potential in the world. And I feel like we're just saying this about every single position group for the Florida Gators. I look at this secondary and I say I'm kind of with you. I don't love that I have him coming in at number 5. Jason Marshall Jr., and I know I get some flack in the comment section for this take. On aggregate, didn't play that bad. Gave up the big play way too much. If he can clean that up, I think we all know he's an NFL caliber dude from a physical trait standpoint. Devin Moore played some really good football. You kind of left out like Kermani McLean or Jakeem Jackson. Like there is a lot of young talent on this team. What you made a good point is they kind of brought in some veteran guys that we know what they are to kind of elevate the floor.
And they get to work in the secondary for a second year. I think that's a really tough thing, especially when you're super young. You take over a new defensive coordinator, new scheme. That was all kind of hitting Florida at once. And again, you kind of mentioned, aside from big plays, I didn't think this unit was too bad. They need to limit some of those. But otherwise, I think this is a unit really talented. Everybody seems like they're like 6'2", long, big, athletic guys. So you have the physical traits I think you want in that unit. I think this is one of those units that's going to catch a lot of people.
You might have sold me. Maybe I'm a little too low because I think you make a good point. I don't know if there's a more complicated defense in the country than what Austin Armstrong tries to do, and that's a lot for kids that were playing high school 12 months ago to kind of digest. All right, I don't know. Maybe I'll put him over linebacker, but that's the most.
Well, both units, because I could make the same things about the linebackers. You got good, true, young, interesting, true freshmen. You had a couple of true sophomores that you really like. Say the same thing about both.
But we're saying the same thing about a lot of this Florida roster. There's a lot of young juice for this Florida team, and again, if they reach their potential, they can be a dangerous team in the SEC. Going to number 6, and you kind of gave me some heat about this before we went live. The running back room. I love Montrell Johnson. The way I look at this running back room is the reason they're coming in at 6 is the depth question marks that I have. So it's Montrell Johnson Jr. wearing the number 1. He's going to be the guy. You're bringing Jaden Baugh, who as a freshman looks to be a guy that's going to play a lot. You have a guy in Treyan Webb. What I want to see a little bit more is just some depth, a little bit more reliability at the running back spot. That's why I have him at 6. But again, there's some young guys that you kind of feel good about in that running back room.
And you have the guy. I mean, Montrell Johnson's played at a very high level for a good chunk of his college career. That's where I kind of, again, when you talk, like there's some units that I still think very much need to prove it. Secondary, linebacker, defensive line. They all need to prove something. And again, on the aggregate, is their talent there? Is it deeper in the running back room? Probably. But I do think Montrell Johnson, there's an element of the way he's played. It's tough for me to put him below those two guys. And again, depth is certainly a question, but when you have a guy who's playing at or has played at a very high level, and then a couple of units that I think, frankly, you need to see a lot more from, that's where I kind of maybe push this running back room up.
Well, it's the off season, so we're supposed to be making some projections, and I'm out here making some projections. That being said, I do really like Montrell Johnson Jr. This was a really difficult one to say.
I also think Jaden Baugh is very, very good. I love the way he played in that spring game.
Yeah, he looked like the real guy, real deal, I guess you could say. Offensive line coming in at 7. You talk about needing to prove it. This is the definition. And we've been saying all offseason, we think it's much better. I mean, you look at the Florida offensive line last year, there was one glaring problem. And it was the right tackle spot with Damian George Jr. You kick him on the inside. You bring in 2 offensive tackles, Brandon Crenshaw-Dixon, who we just kind of feel really good about slotting in and being a very solid tackle in the SEC. Then you have an interesting competition, Austin Barber. Devin Manuel might have the highest upside as an offensive tackle in this room. At least you have capable guys. I think Florida was going into 2023 forced to play Damian George Jr. because they didn't have anybody else healthy. You got 3 tackles that you feel good about. There are not a lot of programs that are going into 2024 saying that kind of thing. Then you look on the inside, Jake Slaughter, sneaky, really good center. Damian George Jr., kind of a wait and see how he plays at guard. And then Najee Harris, that's my guy. I think he can be an all-conference caliber guy over the next couple of years. This offensive line is going to be better. The question is, how much better? And if it's much better, again, this Florida team can be awfully dangerous.
Yeah, and I think the fact that they're sitting there that low is probably had a lot to do with why their record was what it was. Is that
Yes.
was pathetically bad, I thought, last year. And I think you're right. I think this is like a big one for Napier and his like proof of what he's doing. Is he on the right track? If this offensive line plays really poorly again, I think that's, again, I'm not like a Napier's on the hot seat if he doesn't win X number of games. I think he's a bit on the hot seat if like units like this, linebacker, D-line, don't play to their standard, their potential, what they have in that room. So I think, again, the offensive line that's going to be one of the ones I think we're all watching. Like if this group doesn't get better, I think then the seat gets very high.
That's the conversation we've had. For Billy Napier, looking at the 2024 year, yeah, you got to win football games. Nobody's arguing that. There are certain spots on this roster where that's kind of what matters to me in terms of Billy Napier being on the hot seat, retaining his job. Obviously, you want to see some flash from DJ Lagway. That's probably number one. But number two is the offensive line play. And Florida Gator fans know more than anybody, you can't win games in the SEC if you can't hold up on the offensive line. It was one of Billy Napier's calling cards as you hired him to join with development on the offensive line. You got to see it going into year 3. That's probably one of the biggest questions, if not the biggest question within this Florida roster. A lot to prove from this unit, but I think they have some answers on the offensive line. Dill, we'll cut it there. Fascinating conversation. We didn't necessarily agree on a lot of these position rankings. Would love to hear from the Gator fans in the comments section. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.